I'm John Cruz. I'm the host of Northwestern Outdoors Radio. For this podcast, we're going to give you two sides of the Lower Columbia Gillnet Fishery reform argument. On March 2nd, the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission rolled back reforms that were supposed to take place this year that would get gillnets out of the Washington side of the Columbia River. The first person you'll be hearing from is Liz Hamilton with the Northwest Sportfishing Industry Association. They have supported these gillnet reforms that were agreed on by both the states of Oregon and Washington in 2013. The second voice you'll hear is Bill Tweit. He's with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he'll explain why the Fish and Wildlife Commission in Washington took the actions that it did. Liz Hamilton's interview aired on Northwestern Outdoors Radio on March 16th, and Bill Tweit's interviewed on March 23rd. You're back with Northwestern Outdoors Radio. I'm John Cruz, and storm clouds are brewing over the Columbia River this week. The reason why is because promised reforms regarding gill netting on the Columbia River that were supposed to help more endangered wild salmon, wild steelhead return not only up the Columbia, but up the Snake River too, into Idaho. Those reforms are being rolled back. With us here to tell us more about what's happening and why these reforms are under attack is Liz Hamilton, the Executive Director of the Northwest Sport Fishing Industry Association. Liz, great to have you on the air.
Good morning, John. Thank you for having us.
So let me try to sum up what the initial reforms were. Now, back in 2012, there was a voter initiative that was set to shut down commercial gill netting on the Columbia River throughout the state of Oregon. Governor Kitzhaber said, let's talk about this. Let's not be drastic here. Got the state of Washington involved, and a compromise was reached where the gill nets were supposed to be taken off the main stem of the lower Columbia, moved to side channels, and not only that, but alternative methods were supposed to be developed to be used so that we could have selective fisheries, because gill nets, as both of us know, are indiscriminate killers of salmon and steelhead. Fish that get caught in them, they die. Whether they're wild or hatchery, they all die. So that was supposed to happen. But now we're sitting 6 years later, 2019, and these reforms are starting to be rolled back. Let's talk about what the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission did last week to roll back some of these reforms.
On March 2nd, the commission met in Spokane, and most of us had the understanding that they were going to discuss what the work groups had been talking about, the joint state work groups, and instead the commission maneuvered to have a vote, and a vote to repeal the reforms and put gill nets back in the river most of the year, and to roll back allocation, meaning shorter sport seasons and longer gill net seasons on 13 ESA-listed stocks.
Not only that, but they also voted, and this was very surprising to me, to give up the barbless hook rule. We've been told for 25 years that the use of barbless hooks is a great way to conserve wild fish because we can release them quicker, they have less wounds, and they have greater survivability. And for some reason, starting in June, they decided barbed hooks are okay again, and this is in the face of some really low projected runs for both spring Chinook and for steelhead this year.
I think this shows the depth of misunderstanding of the sport fishing community that this commission has. My guess is they did this to mollify or sweeten the pot, thinking that the sport community would for a split second trade barbless hooks for more gill netting and less opportunity to sport fish. It's insane. And again, it shows the depth of their misunderstanding of this community.
I do want to single out one commissioner, Dave Graybill, for standing up and saying he would not stand for these rollbacks, but he was the lone commissioner that voted no. There was a couple of abstentions, but the rest of the commissioners voted for this. Definitely, conservation was not top of mind with their awareness. And it gets worse because we are talking a couple of days prior to this show airing between the 15th and the 17th. on most of our stations. The state of Oregon on the 15th is poised to have a meeting, and they may also institute some rollbacks too.
It's very possible that the state of Oregon will have a discussion similar to what Washington did, and they will use their emergency rulemaking procedures because they have not announced, they've not given their 45-day announcement period for promulgating any rule changes, but they do have authorities under emergency rulemaking, which we have seen them discuss that pathway to get this done. We've also heard commissioners say, we need to make these rule changes before our term as a commissioner is up. So there's some commissioners in Oregon who are in a hurry to ram jam this through.
This is really disheartening to me because if you look at how many commercial gillnetters operate in Oregon and Washington versus how many sport anglers there are in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, I mean, this is truly the tail wagging the dog. How many active commercial gillnetters are actually operating in the Lower Columbia these days?
Well, if you look at landings, it can maximize at about 150 when there's lots of fish and lots of them fishing. So, there's not that many left. I would say 60% of those are from Oregon and 40% are from Washington. NOAA Fisheries did a study of the economics of the gillnet fleet and found that the average annual income from Columbia River gillnetting was something around $8,000 a year.
Oh my gosh.
And you don't just have, close to 400,000 people purchase an extra endorsement to fish in the Columbia River. So you've got all that income and all those licenses. And then our industry pays excise tax when we manufacture goods. That excise tax comes back to Oregon and Washington is greater than the entire fish fund in both states. It's mind-boggling the disrespect of the community that pays for conservation of resource that these commissions are showing right now.
Think about this, folks. 400,000 anglers are paying to fish the Columbia River. We're not even including all of you anglers in Idaho that are fishing the Snake River, that are fishing for these same fish. And this is versus the voices of 150 gill netters or gill netting operations in the Lower Columbia. And somehow the gill netters are coming out ahead on this. Again, the tail wagging the dog is the only thing I can think of. The other thing I think is this is truly disheartening when it comes to thinking that our state agencies in Oregon and Washington, who are supposed to be looking after the resource, sustainable fishing, with conservation first and foremost at mind, seems to be throwing that all out the window. So, Liz, this is awful news, but we've got a lot of listeners that are tuning in from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, other states too, that care about our salmon, care about our steelhead, and realize this is a horrible decision. Is there anything they can do to help turn this back and get those reforms back on track?
Yes. Individuals, this is not going to get solved with the commissions, obviously. We need to contact our state-elected senators, our state-elected representatives, and we need to contact the governor's offices. Many people know that Governor Jay Inslee is running as an environmental governor for president. Ask him why the environmental governor has a commission that is putting more gill netting on ESA-listed stocks. Governor Kate Brown is also known as an environmentalist. Ask her why the Fish and Wildlife Commission is putting more gill nets on ESA-listed stocks. And ask your representatives to do something about it through the agency budgets.
Oh, absolutely. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is asking to renew that Columbia River endorsement this year, and your representative and your senator in Washington State, they can put a screeching halt to that because of this decision or force the agency to revisit this decision. Likewise, Governor Inslee has publicly said he wants to have more salmon to save the southern resident killer whale population in Puget Sound. That includes salmon from the Columbia River. So this decision by his appointed commission makes absolutely no sense. Liz is right. Contact your governors. If you live in Oregon, Governor Kate Brown. If you live in Washington, Governor Jay Inslee. Contact your state representatives, your state senators, and tell them to do the right thing for our fish in the Columbia River and stay true to these gillnet reforms that were promised back in 2013. Liz, thanks for coming on the air today. to tell us about this on Northwestern Outdoors Radio.
Thank you for sharing it with your listeners. It's so important.
That was Liz Hamilton. Now, let's hear the other side from Bill Tweit with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. You're back with Northwestern Outdoors Radio. I'm John Cruz. Last week, we talked to Liz Hamilton with the Northwest Sport Fishing Industry Association about rollbacks to Gillnet Fishery reforms on the Columbia River and how those rollbacks are harmful to sport anglers and conservation. This week, we've got Bill Tweit on the line. He is with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He actually works with the Columbia River Management Unit and the Fish Program, and he's got some input for us about these decisions, why they were made. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John, and good morning.
Well, good morning to you. Let's start off with the Gillnet reform itself. It was adopted by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and by the state of Oregon, too, in 2013. The original intent was to move Gillnet fisheries off the main stem of the Columbia and into off-channel areas where they would net less wild and threatened fish, both salmon and steelhead, and they were supposed to develop new means of using nets to catch these fish outside of gill nets that would result in better survivability if the wrong fish were caught. Fast forward to 2019. What has happened now?
It's proven harder to develop those new gears than we'd initially hoped, or that our commission had assumed when they developed the initial timeline, which called for complete phase-out on the Washington side of gill nets in the main stem by 2019. The difficulties have been several-fold. Some of these gears are gears that have not been used in a long time. In order to use them, we also have to have really solid science that tells us exactly how many or what percentage of the fish that are handled and released, what percentage of those survive until spawning. Conducting those scientific assessments has proved to be more difficult, as well as just continuing to find willing partners, particularly for testing gears like pound nets that require very high capital investment. We are continuing to make progress on that, and we've found a partner to work with us on traps to help with the capital costs of developing traps. And we're hopeful that this combination of mobile and fixed gears will allow us to achieve the Commission's objective, which was to have a viable commercial fishery, but equally have a commercial fishery that's capable of removing large numbers of hatchery fish before they return either as hatchery surplus at the hatcheries or, as importantly, before they return and intermingle with natural fish on the spawning grounds. For several of our ESA-listed stocks, it's that mingling of hatchery fish and natural fish on the spawning grounds that has been identified as one of the primary threats to recovering them. So we're very interested in finding ways of achieving that harvest of hatchery fish, and these alternative gears are really our best hope for a long-term solution for that.
So, Bill, question for you here. We live in the greatest country of the world. In World War II, we went from nothing to becoming a superpower in 6 years. John F. Kennedy said we're going to the moon, and by God, in 6 years, we were on the moon. But here, in 6 years, we can't seem to go ahead and figure out how to improve fisheries in terms of the nets we're using. Wasn't money set aside in 2013 for the purpose of helping these new, more selective netting fisheries?
It was. We underestimated the amount that would be needed, though. Your analogy is great, but when John Kennedy did that, he pretty much opened up the money floodgate.
Well, let me put it this way, Bill. Was the money that was allocated, was it used?
Well, most of it was used. The reason some of it wasn't used was it was specifically purposed for activities that assumed success in the first steps. And because we weren't seeing the success that we believed necessary in those first steps, we were never able to really access the money that had been specifically allocated. If there had been somewhat fewer strings, and if we'd had a more realistic assessment of the difficulty, I do believe we'd be further along.
All right. Well, let's talk about what the commission decided to do on March 2nd in terms of rolling back some of these reforms. Now, the biggest thing I saw was that the allocations of fish going to sport anglers versus commercial gill netters, it was supposed to increase for sport anglers. It's actually going down now, isn't it?
5 commissioners voted in favor of this, and so there may well be 5 somewhat different reasons. From a staff perspective, the practical effect of what they did, first off, this was a short-term actions vote. They have yet to vote on whether or not they would actually want to make any long-term modifications, i.e. durable, lasting modifications to the policy, or change the basic objectives of the policy. And you clearly and well outlined the basic objectives. This vote didn't change those basic objectives. What the staff interpretation of this vote is that the commission said, because we're delayed on implementation for the necessary alternatives, we don't want to lose a commercial fishery in the interim, because it's important for us to achieve the long-term goals of continuing to have an economically viable commercial fishery and long-term goal of having a commercial fishery with the power to remove large numbers of hatchery fish after most recreational fisheries have been able to access those fish.
Let's move on to another decision the commission made, and this one is just a head-scratcher to me. Starting in June, barbless hooks will no longer be required on the Columbia River. I understand when it comes to salmon and steelhead fishing, and there's a huge body of work, 25-plus years old, that tells you that barbless hooks increases the survivability of fish that are caught, particularly wild fish and threatened fish. So why are we going to put barbed hooks back in the river?
The science isn't as clear-cut as you just suggested. First off, the department isn't rolling back the requirements for use of barbless hooks in either ocean areas or Puget Sound. The science is pretty clear-cut that in marine areas, when fish are out in the ocean and still very actively feeding, that the use of barbless hooks, there is a clear advantage to the survival of released fish. The science isn't as clear-cut about what happens once those fish largely stop feeding and switch into migration mode as they go through the transition to being able to handle fresh water, is in essence as they begin to toughen up. In fact, the only clear science for these kind of big in-river fisheries is that the placement of the hook matters to long-term survival far more than anything else. And so trying to discern whether or not there's barbless hooks also cause a difference simply gets overwhelmed by the effect of the hook placement itself.
Well, hook placement is absolutely key, but the corollary to the use of barbless hooks is the easier removal of the hook, which means less stress on the fish once they're in hand, so to speak. And, people will tell you the less time a fish is out of water, the more chance it's going to have to survive, whether it's a salmon or a steelhead that you plan on releasing, and barbed hooks help with that.
So I don't want to make it sound like there's a clear agreement even within the department about the validity of this. The commission did make a decision. They made that decision based on the lack of scientific evidence that there was increased mortality due to the use. They didn't consider in their decision some of those issues around, does it encourage the kind of handling or does it facilitate the sort of safe handling that you just described? That hasn't been considered. And indeed, where the department has really focused on catch and release as the primary fishing opportunity, we still will continue to use barbless hooks regulations in freshwater as well. The Columbia River fisheries, though, aren't really focused on catch and release. Spring Chinook, for instance, over 80% of the catch is retainable because so many of the fish are hatchery fished, and it's a very high mark rate. Similarly with summer Chinook, although it's not 80%, it's often more like 60%, but there's still a high degree of retention. The fall fisheries can vary greatly depending on annual conditions and the rate of hatchery and wild. But there are some fall fisheries, for instance, when the upper right fish are running, which is a very large, healthy, natural run that we do allow harvest on, when the mark rate drops significantly. And there's a concern that with the use of barbless hooks, if that were continued, well, on the one hand, it certainly encourages and assists with careful handling techniques, which is great, and we strongly encourage that as an agency. It also means, because you do lose more fish, that there's a higher encounter rate, that more fish end up getting handled per each fish going home.
Bill, we're going to have to leave it at this because, unfortunately, we are out of time. But I will say this. What you're telling me today regarding the use of barbed hooks versus barbless hooks does fly in the face of information I've been getting from lots of folks, including state agencies, for years. So I appreciate the perspective, and I appreciate your time today on Northwestern Outdoors Radio.
Thank you, John. Good talking to you, and good fishing, everyone.
Want to hear more about fishing, hunting, and conservation? Just go to northwesternoutdoors.com and look for a station near you. You can also hear select segments on Podbean, Stitcher, and YouTube, and of course, on our Facebook page and website too.